Joe's book, and it was actually the first book I read on the Pope, and it was a great book, right? However, like recently, I saw like some quotes that a Protestant friend of mine shared, and like for example, like I think one of his names is Duffy, a Roman historian, and they say something along the lines that okay, it wasn't until like the late second century that this modern or this monarchical episcopate existed, right? Before then, it was kind of like a group thing, like a collegial line of bishops, just making a decision. So that would be more akin to Eastern Orthodoxy or something like that. So my last question is like, how true is this, and does it affect Catholicism in any way?
That's a great question. I love that question. I love that you also cited your kind of sources, because it makes me know that we're at least on the same page in knowing what argument we're talking about. Eamon Duffy is an English historian who is most famous for his work, The Stripping of the Altars. He's a medieval historian, but he's a medieval historian who's written a book called Saints and Sinners, A History of the Popes. And in that book, in chapter 1, like he begins at the very beginning. But Duffy claims that the papacy didn't exist because no bishop existed in Rome until the mid to late 2nd century. And because Duffy's a really well-respected historian, a lot of people kind of perked up. And Duffy's a Catholic, at least in some way, shape, or form. I don't know how Orthodox, how devout he is, but I know that he has, argued this with other Catholic historians and Catholic philosophers and the like. And a lot of Protestants have picked up on this. I actually wrote a piece for Word on Fire responding to Jerry Walls, and Jerry Walls quotes Eamon Duffy pretty extensively on this point. So just to give an outline of the argument and why it doesn't work. First, it's largely an argument from silence. The claim here is that we don't have any direct evidence of the papacy until the mid to late 2nd century. Why doesn't that work? Well, it doesn't work for a few reasons. Because in the 2nd century, you have plenty of people claiming that the papacy has existed from the beginning. The first and most famous example is in 180, when St. Irenaeus writes in Against Heresies. He gives a whole list of every pope from the time of Peter and Paul down to his own day. He's on pope number 13 or 12 after the apostles. The way that historians who are skeptical kind of handle this is by assuming that Irenaeus is just kind of like making this up or inventing this. That's not a good way as a historian to handle your sources, to take unrebutted evidence and assume that the person making the claim is lying. If you did that with any other field, you could say, well, I don't think China had an emperor. All those sources claiming China had an emperor, they're probably making it up. Like, you could do that with anything, but that's just bad history. Second, like Irenaeus isn't even the only one who says this. Hegesippus says this in 160 AD. Tertullian talks about this in 200, where he traces every bishop. So we have 3 different listings from just the year 200 or before, tracing all the bishops of Rome. That's a pretty big thing. But go back even before that. You have, back in like 107, you have St. Ignatius of Antioch, and he writes 7 different letters on the way to his martyrdom. And 6 of those letters are either to the churches of Asia Minor or to his friend Polycarp, who's one of the bishops in Asia Minor. The last one is to Rome, and he's writing there to the Christians, telling them not to interfere to stop his martyrdom. Now, people who argue Duffy's position, Raymond Brown, J.P. Meyer, and Duffy himself all make some variation of this argument, make a big deal of the fact that Ignatius, when he's writing to the local churches about church governance, talks a lot about the structure of the church. And Duffy claims that bishops are never mentioned in Ignatius's letter to the Romans. There's 2 things. First, the reason there's a difference in how Ignatius approaches Rome versus everyone else is probably because the theme of the letter is totally different. He's not saying, obey your bishop, here's how church governance ought to look when I'm gone, because he's not dealing with a church that he had oversight of. Rather, he's dealing with the Christians in the place where he's about to die, saying, I'm willing to do this for Christ, don't try to stop my execution. And so it's not surprising that he doesn't get into the details of church governance, because that's not what the letter's about. So it's a bad argument from silence there, because you wouldn't expect him to talk a lot about church governance. Nevertheless, he actually mentions bishops twice in that letter. He mentions, for instance, that because he describes himself as the bishop of Syria, and then later on says once he is executed, once he's martyred, Jesus Christ will be their bishop. Meaning, like, they won't have a bishop because there's only one bishop per diocese, or only one bishop per city. So he's writing with the assumption that both he and the Romans understand there's only one bishop per church, which wouldn't be true if the Roman church was governed at this time, as Duffy claims, by a group of co-equal presbyters. But even more than that, I'm sorry for such a long answer here, but I think it's worth really fleshing out kind of the history of the 1st and 2nd century evidence here, because I think people underestimate how strong the history is. Ignatius actually praises the Roman church and says it presides in charity. He holds it up as the model church. Now, in 6 other letters, he's clear that he doesn't think you even have a church without a bishop, presbytery, and diaconate, that those are the 3 essential elements to the church. So he can't be praising Rome as a model church or even as a church if it doesn't have all 3 of those things. So that's a lot, I know. I'm going to give you 2 final additional things. One is Pope Clement's letter. I allude to this in my book, Pope Peter, that we see Clement writing on behalf of the Roman Church, intervening in the affairs of the Corinthian church. In that, he compares the structure of their church to the high priest, priests, and Levites in the Old Testament, which means that Clement is writing, assuming the Corinthians have a threefold structure, and writing as if a threefold structure exists. Therefore, also in the church he's writing from, the Church of Rome, and that's around 96 AD. That's, about a century before Duffy claims that the episcopacy existed in Rome. You can't really make much sense over the argument that he's making in chapter 42 of First Clement without understanding that he's making this threefold structure analogy. Then the very last point, if I may, sorry.
Okay, no, that's fine. Go ahead.
There's an argument of silence that goes in the opposite direction. Meaning, assume for a second that Duffy and these other historians are right, that you have co-ruling, co-equal authorities in a really powerful city like Rome. And then along comes somebody and just like claims sole authority for themselves and says, nope, I'm the boss, I'm ahead of all of you now. How's everyone else going to respond? You would expect to find all sorts of evidence in the 1st century or in the 2nd century of people crying out and saying, hey, you're changing the structure of government. You're changing something that the apostles directly set up. You can't do this. Or you'd find someone saying, we need to change it, and here's why we need to change it. Or you'd at least find someone observing in passing that this change occurred. But you don't find anyone observing this, writing for it, writing against it. There's not a single reference to this change ever having happened, or any names of who these co-ruling presbyters were beforehand. We know exactly who the bishops were from the time of Peter and Paul onward. But these imaginary co-ruling presbyters, they don't have names because they don't exist.
Matthew 16:19, considered in conjunction with Matthew 18:18, further demonstrates that St. Peter, the first pope, was given jurisdiction over all the apostles and the entire church. This also powerfully refutes the position of the Eastern Orthodox. Matthew 16 is well known. There Christ promises to give St. Peter, the first pope, the keys of the kingdom and says, whatever you bind upon earth shall be bound in heaven, etc. But the Orthodox will often say, look at Matthew 18:18, where Christ says the same thing, they claim, to all the apostles.
By the way, Jesus gave the whole college of the apostles the ability to remit and retain sins and to bind and loose. Right? It's not just it's not just Peter. You didn't give this to Peter and then tell Peter to give it to everybody else.
Actually, that's in essence exactly what Jesus did, as we will see. Referring to the apostles collectively, Matthew 18:18 says, Amen, I say to you, whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. But far from contradicting the papacy, this verse actually just further illuminates the truth of the Catholic position and refutes the Eastern Orthodox one. Here's why. There's no mention of the keys in Matthew 18:18. The keys are only promised to St. Peter, as we read in Matthew 16. In Matthew 16, we also learn that people bind and loose with the keys. Let me repeat that. People bind and loose with the keys. I will give you the keys of the kingdom, whatever you bind on earth, etc. Peter alone is given that with which one binds and looses. So when all the apostles are given authority to bind and loose, as we read in Matthew 18:18, with what will they be doing that binding and loosing? With the keys, of course. But Peter alone is given them, Matthew 16. So what does that tell us? It tells us that the authority that all the apostles have to act is subject to Peter's distribution or restriction of the keys. Since he is given the keys with which the others act authoritatively, he can distribute the keys to certain people or he can take away the keys. Since they need the keys to act and he's the one who has them, their authority is subject to his. So contrary to what the Orthodox think, a careful consideration of these two passages together further proves the papacy, the teaching of Jesus Christ against which they rebel. We see another contradiction in the Eastern Orthodox position because they readily admit that the See of Rome has a primacy of honor based on texts like Matthew 16, John 21, etc., but not one of authority, they say. But that's obviously nonsense because those texts deal with authority as we just showed. Binding, loosing, tending the flock involve authority. So if those texts teach any primacy for the successor of St. Peter in Rome, and they admit they do, it would be and is one of authority/jurisdiction, not merely of honor.